First take. The schools were interesting. PS20. In elementary school, I grew up in a place that had 2 murals of Joan of Arc painted during the WPA period. One where she received the call of God to save France, and the other which showed her giving the sword of victory to the Bourbon infant, which, as far as I was concerned, was not a great thing, because they immediately went and with treason gave her to the English, who burnt her at the stake. Anyway, outside the auditorium was a black stone plaque that said Abraham Lincoln had opened the school, and it was the first public school in the country. It was there I wore my senior hat with the Spanish Revolution buttons of my father. There, the assistant principal picked me out and said the buttons were communist. I looked at him and said, "So? They're my father's." I was also the smallest kid in my grade every year because I had been entered when I was 4.5 years old. I wore glasses and never lost a fight. As a side note, I was introduced to Colin Power, just back from West Point. I was a school door monitor and asked him how to fight a gang. He said, "Get a bigger gang." The school was burnt down during the era that was called the Bronx is burning. Oh, I refused to speak English until I was in 2nd grade. In the 1st grade, I understood English, and when I was waiting in the hall, I heard 2 school officials talking. One of them said, "We are letting too many Puerto Rican children in." The man said, "Do not worry, they will be gone soon." The woman said, looking at me, "Little pitchers have big ears." The man said, "Don't worry, he does not speak English," and they walked away. When I was in the 2nd grade, I won a contest for putting the music to the UNICEF song. I think it was called "You May Know Your ABCs." I had a head start because I had had my first music lesson from a friend of my father's, Nat King Cole. The school moved me immediately from 2-3 to 3-1, the Golden Kids class, where my girlfriend was. I liked that and started speaking English regularly. By 4th grade, I was going to the public school, to the public library. It was 7 blocks away and had used up all of the children's parts of the library, and I asked permission to use the adult part of the library. I borrowed 6 books at a time to read. I noticed a book called Spy Catcher and read it in 2 days and found that the author had written another book called Spy Chaser. The author's name was Oresto Pinto, so I ordered it. The author came with the book and we talked for a while. Later, a couple of weeks or so, I saw someone who was dressed like Oresto Pinto by a bookshelf. By the time I got there, he was gone, but a book was misplaced. I took it home and it was How to Become a Private Eye. In it, there was the story of a private eye teaching another how to follow. He told him to follow a guy he said was a top agent. The guy followed him up and down Brooklyn, finally got tired because he had walked all over when he could have taken a bus. He walked over to the top agent and gave him a nickel, saying, "You cheap son of a bitch, here, use this nickel for the bus." I remember my father telling me the story about how some guy had walked up to him and told him the same thing. Later, my father brought home 4 jackets, one from the Army, one from the Navy, one from the Air Force, and a trench coat. I really liked the trench coat. Did you know that they put racist questions in the IQ test? So those who thought that white people were smarter would answer them right, and those who were not considered of the white race would answer them wrong? I noticed that and answered them the right way, knowing that the wrong answers were white. To which I said about the test, "Fuck you, I'm smarter than that." Walked up to the tester, I had finished first, and said there were some questions that didn't seem to be fair. The tester shrugged and took my test. A number of years later, it was discovered that the people who were making the IQ test had problem with non-white kids. Herman Ritter, JPS 98. Herman Ritter was an elite middle school with 2 genius classes called Special Progress. Instead of spending 3 years in middle school, they spent 2 years in advanced classes. This meant that I was now 2 years younger than my classmate. It was also next to Cortona Park. This was a very cool thing. PS 40 was the bad school in the district. They had a gang, and they got the gang together and started to beat the boys coming out of the surrounding schools at 3 o'clock. When they came to our school and started to come after us, I yelled out, "What are we running for? We are more than them. Let's get them." The kids from the elite school chased the bad kids from the bad school all the way back to PS 40. They never did that gang trip again. The owner from the Hero shop, the Hero sandwich shop, where the kids got their better lunches, gave me a $10 bill. I thought he made a mistake, but I kept it anyway. The other thing I got out of that school was a comment in my school file, which said, "Instigator." I was dropped from 7 SP1 to 9 SP2 and lost my girlfriend, who I had had since 2nd grade. We were the 2 smallest kids in the class in the grade, so that made sense. It was a sad thing. When it came to choosing the school I would go to next, they sent me, the 12-year-old golden boy, to the worst high school in the nation. In a remark, the guidance counselor said, "Well, it has a good art teacher." Morris High School. I had lost my golden boy attributes at Ritter in a debating club. I had backed China's entry into the United Nations with what I thought was the winning argument. How can you ignore 800 million people? They voted me out of the coach, saying I was a communist. Later, when I asked to go to Bronx Tech, the best science school in New York City, because I wanted to be an industrial designer, the guidance counselor decided I was too small to take the subway and instead sent me to Morris High, the worst school in the nation. Gang-ridden, where only 40% of the children graduated. It was the worst drug and crime-ridden school in the nation, the forerunner of high schools ever since. The excommunication people were happy with that. They figured I would be killed in 3 weeks, small, underage, and almost white. Pope Pius the idiot would be happy. He would say to his people, "The power of excommunication. 2 weeks into the class, on the stairs, the white guy from a black gang said to his friends, watch me beat this little kid. Laughing, he went to grab me, and I put my hand around his neck, squeezing it. I said, leave me alone. I let go of him, pushed my way past the gang, and went to class. 2 weeks into class, I was at the seat of someone who had just been killed outside the school. He had carved his name on my desk. I decided I needed my father's switchblade. He gave it to me. Then I joined the AV squad. Those guys were assigned to cart all the 16mm projectors and speakers to classes. This equipment cost a new Chevy in my time, and to run the projectors. I was 12 years old at the time. What the hell, it's just another machine. Then I joined. After about a month, one of the guys who was kicked out of the AV squad grabbed my ice cream sandwich I had bought in the lunchroom and ran. I chased him into the AV room where all the guys were there, and as I confronted him, he pulled a sharpened butter knife. I turned to the head of the AV squad and said, is that a knife? And he said, yeah. The guy with the ice cream said, what are you going to do? Quick draw. Switchblade out. And I nicked his ear and took my ice cream cone back. My ice cream back. The guy who had just taken the ice cream yelled, saying, he cut me! Blood dripping down from his ear and his hand. They all laughed, and one guy said, I thought you were gay. At 12, I had no idea what they were saying. Anyway, now they knew I was a PR with a switchblade. I was taken to the AV gang. Later, much later, I would realize it was part of a gang rape. At 12, I just knew I belonged. Then a gang leader tried to trade his rug-cutting switchblade for my father's knife. I said no, and he left mad. I broke the switchblade. Too many people knew I had an illegal weapon and bought a slim knife with a Black Panther on it. A few days later, the head of the AV squad showed me a rope burn where they had tried to lynch him with his father down south. He had run away. They had lynched his father. Now I knew that this country also killed black kids. The guidance counselor had been right. So like the priest said, when they came to tell my father we had been excommunicated for fighting Franco and the Pope during the Spanish Civil War, I was to become an artist. Morris had an excellent art teacher. The teacher let us paint with large oak-tagged sheets of paper and oils. He was cool. His lesson was just paint. Here are your tools. I had one of my paintings in the Metropolitan. Unfortunately, oak-tag doesn't last more than 10 years. It just sort of crumbles. After the class was over, I was awarded the St. Gordon's Medal for Fine Draftsmanship, and it was given to me at the museum of Metropolitan Museum of Art, Metropolitan Museum. I was carrying a book called The Day of the Triffids, and when the guy who presented the medal asked what the book was I was carrying, I told him it would make a good movie. It did. But the reason this is important was that the guy who gave me the medal was the same person who sat at the top of the New York State Council on the Arts, who in 1978 allowed me to direct the $250 million prequel and documentary called The Federal Artist, which made the money for 10,000 artists across the nation. According to Reagan later, it was against the law, as only the industrial military complex was allowed to make sponsored promotional media to affect the vote in Congress. As a closing event, Morris played Boys High, a basketball game for the championship, and Boys High cheated by bringing in super seniors to play. They won the game by 4 points. They had cheated, and so as the AV squad and I left, I was overheard saying, "They won the game, but they won't win the fight." Morris High rebelled, and they ripped up Madison Square Garden and beat the shit out of the Boys High looters. Anyway, as the school was ending, I was told that I would not receive an academic diploma, as the English teacher, who had been told by the soon-to-be Cardinal O'Connor, told his sister, who was teaching the class, that she should watch me as I was a bad kid. She gave me the wrong date for the final, and I was not allowed to take the test with the other classes. The guidance counselor said, "So what? With a general diploma, you can make a lot of money as a plumber." I refused, as I expected to go to college. So I took the summer class and passed the test with 92 or 96, I got my academic diploma. Anyway, a week or two before the class ended, I was given a meeting or a date with a woman who was told that I was the baddest kid in the school. I thought she was a cop. As we were ending the meeting, holding hands with me, she told me she was Marilyn Monroe. Shook her head to release her hair and put on her lipstick. She was Marilyn Monroe. She told me that she had been doing research for a class at actor studios based on Blackboard Jungle. She asked me to come to her house, but I said no, as I was too young. I was 15. It would get her into trouble. I added, "You don't know who I am." "When I'm older," I said, as we kissed. Then she took a cab. Next year, she was dead. She hadn't waited for me. From 15 to 22, with my high school academic diploma, my letter stating I wanted to be an industrial designer, and my St. Gordon's Medal for fine draftsmanship from the Metropolitan Museum, I went to an industrial design company and was hired as a messenger and office boy. From Raymond Loewy Williams Nath Premier Industrial Design Company, I was sent to Pratt Institute with my portfolio that I had developed from my stay in the top industrial design company. I had classes with Peter Hansen, the top happening artist and dean of the night school at Pratt Institute, and had classes with the famous photo teacher Art Fried and also photojournalist Bruce Davidson, then sent to work with the famous pop artist Stan Lanzman in the commercial photo studio of Nick Samard, who worked for the advertising world, commonly called Madison Avenue. There I learned how to become the youngest pop artist, how to use advertising to put John Lindsay into the mayor's house, had a few accounts, studied the mystery of woman from a penthouse overlooking the School of Visual Arts, and finally left to become a photojournalist covering the peace movement after crossing the shadow of Orson Welles. This was from 15 to 22 years of age. This is what happens when you live in New York City in the 20th century. The best and most talented people come to work here in that century. I joined a Black Power news agency and went to work with the first black reporter for Life magazine named Mark Crawford, who showed me photojournalism, finding a story and putting together a photo story. Mark wanted to show the black side of things, as he had been taught by the jazz musicians he had been covering that being black in a white man's world was not enough. I understood that. The Transmundo group went to Cicero, a suburb of Chicago, to a civil rights march led by Jesse Jackson and Julian Bond. They were protesting the killings of 2 teenagers who had been brutally beaten to death because they had been found in Cicero after dark. Mark sold the coverage to Eastern Europe since the coverage in the USA had been, if it's white, it's right. Then Martin Luther announced that we cannot make the civil rights movement work without stopping the Vietnamese War. A couple of weeks later, a group of Black Panthers came to Transmundo, and Mark called us in. The group of Black Panthers were Eddie and Teddy Ellis and Angela Davis. Mark introduced them and said they needed a media group. Most of us raised our hands and accepted. When we asked, what shall we do? Angela said, tell the truth. Then we broke up into small groups. I walked up to Angela and asked what I should do. She said, make love. This was a time of make love, not war, so I decided that my approach should be to give personal information to the women of the new generation. Then the Newark riot happened. I was over at Transmundo when the Newark riot blew up. Mark told me to get down there and he would meet with me later. Instead, he went and got Gordon Parks and went on assignment for Life magazine. I got there and stopped at a bar at the beginning of Springfield Avenue and waited for them. He never came. While there, the TV was on and said that they were going to kill all the looters they caught. So there went my photos. I was not going to kill any person with my camera. Nevertheless, it was my duty to see the uprising as a Black Panther, to see what the people were doing to defend themselves from the white structure that had decided to evict them all from their homes to build space for Rutgers University. What I saw when I went down the hill were people, streams of people carrying TVs to their homes, to the background smoke from burning places. Saw jeeps with machine guns. And then the streets were empty as I reached the wooden buildings, the residential houses. I heard gunfire, then machine gun fire. The National Guard were all white. I reached the end of the street where a cop told me to leave. I said I was press and showed him my card. He said, not enough. You need a police press card. Mark had taken them both. All right, this is Media and Archetypes. Jane and I were laying on the floor, someone nude, discussing which way the revolution would go. Brave she was, calm I was, having walked through the Newark riot by myself, unable to take a picture because the police would use them to arrest the rioters, and there was a death sentence attached to them. We talked about what would work. Jane would use her star personality to bring the differing viewpoint of the war in Asia, and I would use mass media to break the one voice the government had applied to the nation's media. The government heard about the new direction we were taking that movement to, and tried to kill Jane while she was in North Vietnam on a peace mission with F-4 warplanes bombing the place where they thought she was in. She escaped the murder attempt, and when the government called her Hanoi Jane, she became an even more powerful spokespersonality, giving her the podium to demand the removal of President Nixon. Transmundo and South Africa. A meeting was called for the Black Panther group at Transmundo to introduce a South African photojournalist. He showed us the non-white side of South Africa. The people were skinny and dying. They were under the subjugation of whites who had guns and looked like they thought they were gods. I asked, what can we do about it? He said, Mandela said, we have to get South Africa out of the strategic materials list. South Africa has chromium and rhodium that were essential for the building of jet engines. They are rare elements only found in South Africa and one other nation under the Iron Curtain. I said, we have to stop the Iron Curtain first. I walked away and said, I will do it. I have no idea what the blues is. I marched in Cicero in '68 and saw white people screaming for the blood of black people. I have no idea what the blues are, as I have seen old black men defer to young white kids. I have no idea what the blues mean. My heart is not injured by 400 years of lies. I have no idea. I cannot play the blues because my soul does not scream injustice. My music sings about me and my soul. I cannot play the blues, but Howling Wolf can scream the song, and Muddy Waters wails the pain. And listen, history. This music is not an ornament to be hung on a master's wall. The first Puerto Rican Black Panther. Transmundo was breaking up due to the heat that Mark had caused with his story on the Newark riots that had broken the rules and been published as a Life magazine cover and story. I asked him to get in touch with the Black Panther leaders and give me the title as the first Puerto Rican Black Panther, so that it would save a lot of discussion as to why I was not black among the brothers. They called back next day and said it was cool. As a Puerto Rican, I am also 1/4 Arawak, one of the tribes that lives in Puerto Rico, and a part of the indigenous group the indigenous people call the nation. But then the Black Panthers knew that. Double cool. The FBI used the title to try and kill me as they arranged a Puerto Rican group as part of their killers for Division 5 that they could use against other Puerto Rican activists. I survived the bloody attack. The work of the first Puerto Rican Black Panther. A Black Panther gave me an apartment on 10th Street in the East Village. It was the center of the young generation revolution, and I went to work finding women that I could talk to about the revolution, brave enough to spread the word. I met one beautiful Southern lady that changed my mind about Southern people. So it was a learning experience for me also. A couple of weeks later, a hippie poet brought over an older white man and introduced him as Robert Vaughn, the poet companion to the Cuban Revolution. The old poet said that he was from Florida and a hipster from the Beat Generation. Then introduced me to LSD, he called it Purple Haze. In the many conversations, I asked him how we could stop the Vietnam War. He answered, "You need to use the rich kids." He also taught me how to use acid to control its properties to communicate. The major technique was set and setting. He had been introduced to LSD when he came back from Cuba and was questioned by the CIA. The anti-war, the anti-civil rights group soon found out about my information plan and spread bad news about me, so I had to leave the state. This is how you get from the New York riots to Key West, the short version. This is from a book that I did with Fred Good on the poet Robert Boardman Vaughn. It's called Maureen. It was never published because Vaughn was problematic. He was one of Fidel Castro's lieutenant and fairly famous beat poet of the 60s and the 50s. Anyway, I'm back from the riots. I'm waiting around for the next show, and I am sent this guy who turns out to be Robert Boardman Vaughn. Who knows who he is? I don't. But he is a poet companion to Fidel Castro during the revolution. Yeah, all right. Let's see what you got. Brought friends. And now he's going to talk about poetry and revolution. And it goes, oh, I forgot to tell you, he also brought my first tab of acid. Después de la Guerra Civil, 1952. The sun would set just off the edge of Father's bed, turning the window shades a golden orange, the sky visible in the cracks, caused by the breeze escaping from Manhattan. All was well for us, too young to share the woes of the world. My father would only play the Spanish 78s when he was too drunk to care it was 1952. And we conjectured, me, my wife, and child, as we headed back to New York, where I ended up at the Lower East Side in the hippie-painted building, and went looking for work as a photographer, a darkroom man, the photo industry. Then, on December 8th, 1969, was what looked like it was going to be a great day. First, I had gone with Fred Good of Real Great Society to Gray Advertising and sold an idea to them to make a VHS channel called Community Television Network, where we could have small studios in each of the 5 boroughs and let it be run by community people, and Gray Advertising could do the advertising on it and have a cheap way of testing out their advertising ideas. Good idea. It was 1969. The only people who had access to media was ABC, CBS, NBC. Those were the 3 networks. No one else could get anything talked about. When I had covered the Cicero March, it was a big march, but the thing that the media focused on was the fact that a white nationalist, Nazi, had been run into by a bayonet from a National Guardsman. This was the big story. The big story, of course, was over 1,000 people had marched in Cicero to highlight the fact that 2 young boys, had been murdered for being in Cicero after sundown. So it was time to break up the idea of just 3 networks. So I got through them. They thought it was a great idea. So I went and took my, because as I said, it was December 8th, my birthday, 25th birthday. And I took a little bit of money and I got my typewriter out of hock and went off to my house, my apartment in the hippie tenement. That's the one that was all painted up. It looked great. Anyway, 4 days earlier, the police had killed Fred Hampton, shot him in his bedroom, in his bed, claiming they were guns. Okay. I had a funny feeling about the 25th because I had a dream long ago that said I wasn't going to make it to my 25th birthday. But they missed, because my 25th birthday was at 6 a.m. and it was already 6 o'clock in the afternoon. I walked in and I was followed by, I believe, 5 guys. One guy stayed downstairs and yelled out 5D, Vida. And the other 4 went up behind me. When I got to the 2nd floor, one of them did an acrobatic thing and blocked my entrance to the 3rd floor where I lived. The other 3 were downstairs. I was not going to go up to my house where my wife and child were, but there was a steel door, but I wouldn't take that kind of risk. You know, you protect your family. They came at me, one guy with a carpet knife, nasty little thing. It's curved like a scimitar, and it's a switchblade. And he went after my throat. I should say that being tough, a Black Panther, I had had some karate training, Korean, and one day I had been doing my fighting stance, and an old Marine was walking through the class and said, "That's the wrong way. You cannot have your neck exposed. Keep your neck close to your chest. Don't stick your neck out." And then hit me. But that was the way that Korean karate makes sure it sticks. So you know. So anyway, he cut, and he cut deep, but he couldn't get my throat. Instead, he got my chin, where I have this beard, so that I don't have to think about it too often. And the other two guys, the other one cut my hand and took the typewriter away. They missed my Nikon, which was on my shoulder, but you know, when a photographer carries his Nikon, you're not supposed to see it, so whatever. The guy who was in charge wore a camel hair coat, expensive, and all of a sudden I was leaking blood. There was blood on the tenement, and I looked at them. They looked at me. They thought they'd killed me. Well, the shot to the neck. It wasn't the neck, it was the chin. So I was going to die. Anyway, I asked them why, and I said for money. I took out my wallet and threw it at them. There was $2 in it. There was now blood going everywhere. The guy with the camel hair coat had blood on him. The guy who had tried to kill me had blood on him. The other guy, you know, his hand was full of blood. And then, looks like I'm going to die, right? Okay. It's the 20th, it's the Immaculate Conception. I was born on the Immaculate Conception, one of the great holy days of the Catholic Church. Now, I am excommunicated, as we all know from previous things, but from next door came two mean, big Doberman pinchers, barking, ready to strike. From the other side of the hallway came a man named Salvador, means in English the Savior, with a white dashiki, red beard, a long red beard, and a metal pole that was taken from the guardrail, you know, but with a golden tip. And they came out. And these guys who had been looking at this blood thing, waiting for me to die, all of a sudden saw dogs and a guy with a spear. And they split. Uh, the woman who had the dogs let me in, and they gave me a towel, and I wrapped my chin. And, they called an ambulance, and they sewed me up. And that was my 25th birthday. New Orleans, 1970. After I got hit in the Lower East Side by a professional killing team, we split to New Orleans. I was all bandaged up, hand and face. I figured that after the city had seen Easy Rider, they were more sensitive to the killing of hippies. We did Mardi Gras. No other way of saying it, as even a sightseer do Mardi Gras when they're within a block of the French Quarter. Met with Jim Garrison, the district attorney, who was played by Kevin Costner in the movie JFK. Looked at him, talked to him about the incident in the Lower East Side. We talked for a while. I told him about the getting a UHF station and stuff like that, and then getting hit on that day. And those guys, they're very professional. Then, it was over at the bookstore, La Libreria. That's the place where people come in when they're intellectuals and don't have Facebook. Anyway, the day after Mardi Gras was over, the sheriff of New Orleans came to where I was staying. I don't know how he knew, but they knew, and told me I had 24 hours to get out of town. I left. I later heard that the FBI had come to town with guns blazing. I then left to a small town in Pennsylvania and spent spring in a small farm getting better. New Orleans, a strangeness. While tripping in the French Quarter, I vibed the Nazis that were running an import-export store front office in the French Quarter. LSD is strange. It breaks fences you keep in your mind. I knew it was Klaus Barbie and Kurt Waldheim. Perhaps I overheard their names. Don't know. But walking around, I saw an old Mercedes and left a note in it which said, "I will buy this car." I had no money, but, acid. Later, when I went to the UN as protector to the Holy Roman Empire to stop the AIDS pandemic, one of the proofs was a painting of the Westphalia Treaty that unified Germany and made peace with the Holy Roman Empire. The Germanic prince sitting on the floor in front was the spitting image of me when I was teaching in the South Bronx. Okay. Columbia University. In 1970, Jane sent word that she had married all the men she had had intercourse with. I now knew I had an SDS family. That meant I had influence in any university, as the Students for Democratic Society was the power of any college in the United States. Nixon had sent the leaders of the student rebellion, Black Panthers, SDS, to jail and sent Division 5 to take care of the rest they could not jail. A lesson learned from the way Henry Kissinger, one of the president's advisors, had dealt with the intellectual activists Vietnam. Columbia, who had been subject to a famous student strike in 1968, hired William McGill from Santa Clara in California. He was famous for arranging the jailing of Angela Davis and stopping the student strike there. McGill was brought in 1970 to stop the volatile student population at Columbia University, which was surrounded by Harlem. I immediately took my portfolio full of civil rights, peace march, and some advertising photos and enrolled in general studies, the Adult Education School of Columbia University. General Studies was created to give the GIs returning from the Second World War college education. I had got a full scholarship, President McGill made a tour to all the schools, introducing himself to the students. When he got to General Studies, I accused him of the racist practice the university was practicing in giving off campus housing to students. He thought I was going to throw something at him and blocked in defense. The student audience looked at this new president as if he was crazy. I waited till this madness was over and told him about my need for housing since I had a pregnant wife and a child. He said he would look into it. The editor of the school newspaper, The Owl, came over and guessed I was a photographer since I was carrying my camera bag and made me the Owl photographer. That week he assigned me to go with a reporter to interview the president in his office. The president did not recognize me when he was talking about me. It was a photographer's trick, where the person you are photographing is told by body language not to be aware of the camera for that candid look. When the editor of the newspaper noticed that McGill had not recognized the GS student who had made an impression on him, which was me, he put my photo of him in the center of the centerfold article, laughing. Under the caption said, "Why is this man laughing?" This was sufficient to make me the photographer, who always carried a camera bag, an underground star, recognized by SDS, the Black Panthers, a few Buddhist groups, everybody in the neighborhood, and the volatile student group which McGill had been brought to control. The college newspaper, The Owl, had a large circulation. In 1972, the White House said the war in Vietnam was over. In 1972, General Studies provided us with a committee called the Higher Educational Opportunity Program, HEOP, whose job was to find Hispanic students to enroll in our university. Interesting, it was 3 students who were named Emilio and one an ex-soldier called Victor. One, Emilio, went to the college, the other went to the School of Social Work, and Victor and me were at General Studies. In 1973, students came out of Kent Hall, the School for Asian Studies, and yelled, "The U.S. is mining Haiphong Harbor in North Vietnam, where the Russian ships are. The war is going on." After April, the White House was getting ready to start a limited nuclear war with the Soviet Union, while claiming the U.S. was withdrawing its forces. The students of Columbia University closed down the university in 1973. HEOP had a meeting where the 3 Emilios and Victor decided to strike in solidarity with the students. Emilio from the college went back to his group who were young and counseled them that they should do nothing stupid so the nation would stay on our side. Emilio from the School of Social Work went to make sure that media would report the student strike around the nation fairly. And Victor and I kept a survey going on the campus grounds. "Shut it down," the students chanted as they marched across College Walk and on to Bernard and back. They held the school closed till the end of semester, and in late June, McGill brought in 300 policemen and the campus police and broke the strike. First they attacked the student body that was amassed on the campus grounds. Then they went school by school and threw out all the students who had occupied the classrooms and offices until they got to General Studies. That school held. McGill came to me and said, "I know you're in charge over there." I told him, "They won't even let me in." Then I, the Black Panther, went to Low Library and signaled officially the Olympic Black Power raised left arm salute for the neighborhood to see. Everyone now knew GS was backed by the neighborhood that surrounded Columbia. The cops retreated. Lewis and Hall was closed to the police and their thugs. The student strike held. It was reported in every high school newspaper across the nation, and they kept count of all the days we remained closed. In some schools it was a joke. The government media control had forgotten that the high school newspapers were also media, and it was nationwide. Remember, this is during the time of the graft, where teenagers were being forced to serve in the military. Then in 1974, Victor came to my door and said, we, General Studies, had been in solidarity with every school that had closed. The college kids and the teenagers told their fathers who were in power, and SDS lobbied the government, showing them the nation was telling that they wanted the war shut down. And the nation closed the war by simply not giving them any more budget. The government agreed and canceled the budget on the war. The war in Southeast Asia was shut down. (1977 to 1980). The Federal Artist. While Jimmy Carter was in power, three important things happened to me in 1977 through 1980. Las Americas nominated me as one of the 100 most important writers in Hispanic America. The CETA Arts Program chose me as one of the 300 artists to fund and work for the cultural programs in the city of New York. The Council on the Arts awarded me a grant for and the Council for the Arts awarding me a grant for the erotic representation of the Mideast conflict. Being recognized as one of the 100 best writers in Hispanic America was nice, because I was part of the Spanish Honor Society of Columbia University. After being interviewed for CETA, AVIF, I was asked to present My Country 'Tis of Thee as a sample of my work as a filmmaker, and was accepted to the federal program called CETA Artist Program, the Comprehensive Employment and Training Program for 300 artists in New York City. AIVF, the Association for Independent Film and Video Makers, created a group called FIVF to document the CETA Arts Program. In a short time, the nationwide media of this nation, who had been happy with the government spending money on the war in Southeast Asia, was editorializing that the government was spending money on artists instead of nurses and firemen. It was a brutal attack on paying artists to work for the community. Because I had 7 years of learning to direct at the Columbia University Film School, me and the producer, Mark Levin, took the task of making the documentary work to help the artist program survive. We had an independent group of artists, so it was lots of fun. Not having time to finish our documentary, The Federal Artist, we quickly made a trailer for it so Congress could see what the artists were doing in the community. And AIVF bought the trailer before Congress could cast a vote on the future of the CETA Arts Program. Instead of canceling the program, they expanded it to 10,000 artists nationwide. That was $100 million going to artists. We finished The Federal Artist just in time for the next vote on the cancellation. Congress refused to show it. They said it was too long. So I convinced WITA, the local Washington, D.C. public television network, to show the documentary. It was then read into Congress. The CETA Artist Program was renewed for a year and a half. The artists made $150 million. The federal artist and its trailer made not for banks the money, but for the artist community, $250 million. It was the highest grossing film and video piece, more than Star Wars. Yes, Star Wars was mostly video, and any of the other Hollywood films of that year. Let go. Then after CETA came a grant from the Council on the Arts in New York State for a film called Little Peace. It was the erotic representation of the Middle East crisis, where I suggested that Israel was a naked woman available to Arab and Jew at the same time. I made it for the horny diplomats at the United Nations so that they could stop thinking of violence as a solution to the problem of who gets Israel. Delivering it was difficult as the State Department was involved. I left for a vacation after that. The Reagan years. Actually, for me, it began at the end of the first year of CETA, when I was left alone. As it was Christmas, and being a Buddhist, I volunteered to take the office. Ronnie Reagan, came to the office wanting to have his private ballet dance videotaped. I said I would do it, even though I was the only one in the house. I took the Sony Portapack and did his one-man ballet. He came back after New Year's and demanded professional close-up cut-ins. I explained to him it was not possible because of our low-tech system. This was during an FIVF meeting at the round table in our office. He then had a fit, bouncing off the walls, yelling that his mother would get even with us for not doing what he wanted. We just did not have the editing equipment that we wouldn't get for another 6 months. When President Ronald Reagan got into office, he declared that the federal artist was illegal, as it had been done by participants of a federal program to save their jobs. This explains why Nancy Reagan made sure that one of the hotspots in the AIDS pandemic would be in my neighborhood, when they changed a large funeral home into a medical center that seemed to use dirty needles on the local population. When the federal artist and its prequel made the federal government fund the arts to the tune of $250 million, the president, Ronald Reagan, called the media effort illegal, saying that people involved in the program could not lobby for its continuance, forgetting the military-industrial community's common practice. AIVF and FIVF got the attention of the Reagans since Ronnie Baby had complained to his mother, Nancy, as he threatened he would do so. I was a director who had told a spoiled child we couldn't give him or his close-ups for the dance tape. So I expect I was the head criminal of the illegal videos that had made more money than any of the films that were made in 1978-9 in Hollywood. This gave Reagan a chance to use their power in the White House to play scripts on me. the director. Criminal to his presidency, his philosophy, Nancy and his spoiled son, Ronnie Baby. None of them work. New York is not Hollywood. The story of the hat. A gift from Sita and the CAPS program. An award that was given to me by the Council of the Arts program to make the erotic representation of Mideast problem. Vis-a-vis the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. I was making it for the United Nations. Across the street from their office was a small store that sold high-end hats. The building was owned by Delmonico, the high-end restaurant for super-rich businessmen. The hat was in the window and marked $20. When I walked out of the office, having been told that they could not accept my second attempt at my grant film called A Little Piece, I noticed that the other hats were marked in the hundreds. The grant office was being hounded for granting Mapplethorpe, a famous gay artist, a grant to show his work. The hat appealed to me, being a cap and such, so I bought it. The salesman was quick to point out that the felt had a flaw in it, so it was not waterproof. By the way, a number of years later, the felt adjusted itself to me and the flaw disappeared. Best part of the hat was that it was a symbol to the IRS that a hat is just a hat. But when needed as a symbol of great wealth, it is all that is needed. The hat did the job. To those in power when worn by the protector to the Holy Roman Empire. London, 1983. An English lady needed my help. Everyone was dying around her. So Susan, my punk underground artist, told me to go and help her. She left out that this English lady was 8th in line to the English crown. I was in the midst of trying to figure out how to archive my art so the Reagan plot to disappear me and my work would fail. Apparently, I was part of the intellectual group that Reagan and his friends considered dangerous to American history. While walking around, I found the British Art Museum. I entered, and the first exhibit was paintings by Esteban Bartolome Murillo, very rare in the United States. Esteban Bartolome Murillo was the premier painter of the golden age of Spain. I thought about it and realized my artwork would be safe in Britain. I felt I left my work with MI5. That was taken care of, and then I went to find the people who had killed my wife, Margaret Williams Murillo, that 8th in line to the English crown. They killed Maggie in London. She died in my arms. After they took her away, I watched the shower of meteors in the sky with her black cat. The normal world disappeared, and on that day when I became homeless, as they had all my money, and the apartment I lived was now a police area, I walked up to a cemetery that was in downtown London and slept. I woke up 20 years older and knew that which London was and the royal way. She had died trying to take care of the royal estates put under her responsibilities. She was not involved in her former lover Tony Anthony's work with the anti-nuke movement. He also had been killed by what can best be described as an international group of pro-Cold War warriors. The real estate interests that were hanging out with them piggybacked the killing of Maggie to get to downtown London for Trump so he could have a casino to rival the Ritz. You know, I think this was probably a Romeo and Juliet trip. Maggie being the girl and me being the boy, and the families killing each other. I don't know. But it sounds like really bad Hollywood. The drop coin and the Korean jet plane. It was going to be easy. The Russians had withdrawn their nukes from Europe. It was just a matter of time before the world would be safe from the crazies running the nuclear show. I was asked to consult. I was known for my ability to understand the bureaucracies running the military. I counseled media targeted to the young and wealthy to start the ball rolling. It was going to be a peaceful transition, with the rich kids changing the economy from military to domestic work. Russia was already agreeing. They asked for my advice, since I was the American who had come to help the Europeans. After Maggie died, it was obvious that we were all under attack. They had killed not only Maggie, the eighth in line to the English crown, but the son of MI6, who was also murdered, with 2 real estate agents living in the bottom floor. This was heavy power. Still not sure what was going on, I recommended that they should leave London until we knew what was going on. Many went on the plane Korean 007. It was brought down and all were killed. I left for New York City expecting to have my plane shot down too. But since I was not rich, I was not enough of a target, and the plane landed safely. In the ensuing days, as I walked around to reorient myself in New York City, I found a crowd of people making nasty remarks about what I had done in London. Finally, on Broadway and 93rd Street, they became obvious and threatening. They were trying to drive me out of town. By instinct, I drew a quarter out of my pocket and flung it on the sidewalk, where it bounced and struck a Volkswagen Sirocco. A shadow blocked out the sun. It had been very sunny. There was no sound of an airplane, but then the darkness became the shadow of an airplane. Still no sound, and went up Broadway. The crowd that had been on the verge of attacking stopped and ran away. I walked home to my mother's place where I was staying and thought about the plane that had been shot down. The AIDS pandemic. The funeral parlor across the street was sold. It became a medical center. The pharmacy across the street from that changed hands. And above the door across the pharmacy, which was a big pharmacy, they painted the symbols for the masters of the alien slave ship that had landed. It was a Channel 5 science fiction show, but they painted those things. Anyway, after the medical place was no longer a funeral parlor, the Catholic worker said that where I was living, 10453 had the highest rate of infection for AIDS. It became that. I wonder what that was about. Could it have been that Nancy Reagan was still trying to get even for her son not getting the royal treatment when he came to FIVF? Yeah, could have been. They called her Dragon Lady. And we know that the AIDS pandemic attacked the intellectuals of this country. Teaching at South Bronx Job Corps. This school consisted of teaching high school age students who had been given the choice of jail or living in the school and going to classes given there when they could be taught and receive a GED so they would become useful citizens. I taught math and world of work. The 2 field trips I took the kids on were the Hagen Planetarium for the math class and the United Nations for the world of work class to show them the possibilities of working beyond the low service jobs that they were expecting. The UN gave us a guide and we were shown various places where work was being done. When we got to a hall that was devoted to the World Health Organization, I vibed that this place was a place of honor. She finished the tour by taking us to the United Nations bookstore so my students could pick up info on job applications. Anyway, I was fired because of the flu that left me sick for a week. They said that, but I feel it was because I had sent a request to the White House for information on getting on AIDS so that I could protect my students. What the Reagan White House sent was a bureaucrat who watched my class without saying a word afterwards. The man on the inside. When Colin Powell became the National Security Advisor, I sent him a letter congratulating him on his important post and reminded him of the time back in the South Bronx when a policeman introduced me, then a school guard for the 3rd grade entrance into PS20, and told me he was a graduate of West Point. We talked about military tactics, and I asked him what to do when a group attacks, and he said, get a bigger group. I understood and kept that information in my mind after that. Sending him that letter before I became protected to the Holy Roman Empire was a necessity. The Reagan White House had made silence a way to run the government, and I needed someone that would listen to me. Once I did the move on the United Nations, I knew they would tap my phone and Colin would be the natural to keep tabs on me. He was the National Security Advisor. The credentials. When I left my dead wife in London, I was told that I was a duke. These are men that protect the royalty and the people of the English nation. I knew there were people who thought that they could get away with anything. Imagine having killed the son of the head of MI6 and the princess who was eighth in line to the English crown in London. This was not the stupidity of racism. That was easy. Look for whites in power and follow their script. In New York City, I spent a number of years studying what was going on and putting it into a file, nay book, called The Informal Government and Its Effects on the United States. Now I knew what the power was that they were using to control the inhumanity that was being visited on the world. What I found out was the movement of their overpopulation device was ruled by few people, controlling a humanity that did not have their idea of Nazi control of the population solution. It was a small group, easily overpowered by the right kind of power. Also, this pandemic was going to cause a war because the facts of its mechanism were now obvious. It became clear what the power I had to acquire and where I could use it. Once I stepped on United Nations land, I was no longer a citizen, an American citizen controlled by the US. I was royalty with a job to do. So I took to them my declaration of being protector to the Holy Roman Empire, which I sent a letter to Pope John Paul II, and this was the same letter that I placed in the hands of the security guys at the United Nations, who liked it. Anyway, this is the letter. By the grace of all humanity, by the divine right of history, by the right of protector to the Holy Roman Empire, with the reputation and responsibility of cultural, civil, and military authority for stopping war, I hereby declare cause of military conflict subject to enforced and binding arbitration, so that no wars may start within our realm of influence, and further, that all nuclear and genocidal weapons be moved off Earth in such a manner and at such a distance that the weapons will protect all of humanity from external invasion. In my hand, Emilio Murillo. I was a duke attached to the Tudor crown by marriage, a German prince by heredity, and presented myself to the United Nations and Pope John Paul II as protector to the Holy Roman Empire. Additionally, I had been pressed into action by the arts community to stop the AIDS pandemic. This kind of focused power and the research I had done to find the cause and the people responsible for the worldwide AIDS pandemic was sufficient to bring it to United Nations for action. The work of the protector to the Holy Roman Empire. This is a package that was taken to the United Nations. It includes the history of Joachim von Triploken, who used the virus that was developed in his chemical plant to make a new wine into sherry, and then used that virus for the Nazis to use in Africa on prisoners in a concentration camp to develop a way to kill the slaves they were working to death. The package also included a book on Klaus Barbie that connected him to Kurt von Waldheim, the SS officer and former head of the United Nations, who was famous for disappearing French prisoners into Joking's prison. I included my photo ID that showed my genetic connection to a German prince who helped make the historic Westphalia Treaty happen. The image of the prince was displayed in the photograph of the painting of the commemoration of the signing of that treaty from a book on the Holy Roman Empire. The prince sitting on the floor was a spitting image of me. Also included was a copy of the letter that identified me as protected to the Holy Roman Empire that had been delivered to Pope John Paul II and Navier de Quella, head of the United Nations. The United Nations knew who I was, as they had done a background check on me when I had presented that same letter to the security staff of the United Nations. They had agreed to pass it on to the head of the UN. All this I presented to the UN bookstore with the World Health pen I had bought from them. Next day, the United Nations went into action, and subsequently the Surgeon General of the United States, Coop, announced that the way to stop from getting AIDS was not to use dirty needles or have unprotected sex. He then sent a letter to everyone in the United States saying the same thing. When we had command of the Reagan White House, who was under blackmail for running the AIDS pandemic, I sent a message to Colin Powell that one of the proofs that would be needed from Russia that the Cold War was over was that the satellite nation who had the chromium and rhodium would be allowed to sell the elements to the United States. He took the message to President Reagan as he was leaving to meet the Russian leader. Russia said yes, and that was the end of the protected state of white South Africa. The devil apartheid died that day. Well, on to the next time I got famous. My shows were starting to appear on cable. I was the editor-in-chief of a newspaper called Harlem Windows. I was working in Harlem. This for Black Panther is a very interesting reality. And it was for a federal program. So I was walking off to my office under a bridge, one of those beautiful bridges in Harlem where the subway runs over, and it's a beautiful thing. Anyway, I'm walking through, and I get to just about going out of the covered bridge, and all of a sudden I feel this energy. And I stop, and crash. And down came a huge sling that they use for moving subway cars. Walked out, looked at it, and noticed over 50 people with suits and ties waiting, watching for me to get smashed like a cockroach. A woman came up to me and said, "Did somebody warn you?" Looked at her, the mess of construction weight on the floor, the 50 or so people watching, and left. Went to my office, my beautiful office overlooking Marcus Garvey Park. Did my work, came back, and I was going to go through there again because, once is enough. I know it's an accident. But up on top of the bridge was this guy that I had seen before when I was doing an erotic representation of the Mideast crisis for the United Nations and for the State Department. That time, he had been friendly and left a zip gun in the house for me. Zip gun, this is New York. You don't do that kind of stuff. So I went down with it. But this time he was back there with a huge sledgehammer, 20-pounder, I think, waiting for me to go across. And so I saw him and said, "Nah," and walked across the street. He looked at me, threw down his hammer, and walked off. Next day, my boss, a nun, sold me her car, and that was the end of my carefree walks in Harlem. Starting Earthbird Presents. I had a meeting arranged to get my show on cable. I was showing the stoppers here to an important cable guru. I drove down the street in the West Village where all of a sudden an SUV hit my old Hyundai. I had the right of way. My right-hand signal was turned on, but as I went into the right-hand lane, he hit me. I stopped and scratched his SUV. Then 6 white cops in civilian clothes jumped out smelling of alcohol, and they started an incident with threats and one guy saying he was calling 5-0. They were getting into bad cop movement. I guess they were expecting Black Panther rage as they surrounded me. I thought of missing my meeting and the destruction of my film. Oh well. The village made a crowd around me and the cops lost their grit. One person in the crowd yelled, "He didn't do anything." I noticed the driver had been drinking. The leader, who had not been drinking, said to the group of 6 officers, "Let's get out of here." They left. I looked around and the crowd was gone. I shrugged and went to the audition, showed the film in Super 8. The guru had a working sound Super 8 projector. Very strange. Next day, I got a call from asking for my executive producer. My daughter came down looking like a very professional Joan Crawford. They gave me the time slot, 6 p.m., every other Thursday, next day. Today, after being taught by black Lives Matter education, I realized I was a target for a police hit. This was a few weeks after they thought they could smash me like a bug in Harlem. They also hit my car, just like Frank Gaffney, the professional killer, had hit my BMW back in 1968. He was the man with the woman in a polka dot dress that had been involved in the Robert Kennedy killing. Well, 6 o'clock every other Tuesday. Freedom of speech came with Earthbird Presents and the Free Poets. This was before 9/11, when they declared that anyone who used free speech to seek peace was a terrorist. This story is one of the events that happened after 9/11. After 9/11, George Bush, the shrub, decided that after the Twin Towers were hit, that media who wanted peace in the Middle East would be considered helping terrorists. And as such, we became terrorists because we were looking for peace. Peace is always good, except for him. Anyway, 9/11 happened. The planes hit the Twin Towers while George Bush's father and the father of Osama bin Laden were sitting down having lunch. You know, this is their story. And next thing that happened, one of my video machines, the editor, died all of a sudden. It just stopped working. There'd been an electrical thing, you know, in the house. So I took it over to a repair shop on Queens, in Queens, New York. And they said, well, leave it here. And so I left there and came back. Then they called me up and said, we want the remote to go with it. So I drove back and took the remote, and they gave it back to me. They said, we don't need it anymore. All right. So I come back to my apartment in this house that I live in was built in 1910, 1912. Lots of marble, real hallway, you know, the whole bit. And I walk in, and all of a sudden behind me, a voice said, turn around, drop the gun. Gun? This is New York. I don't have a gun. You have a gun in New York City, you go 2 years in jail. I'm a New Yorker. We know these things. I noticed that they were small, around 5'7". New York cops are big. They're 5'10", 5'12", 6 feet, 6'3", you know. They don't have guns here, so it's like a physical thing. So cops are tall and big. Anyway, there they were, all shiny in their shiny new police blues with revolvers. New York City cops had gone to automatics 10 years ago. It was really weird. And I'm looking, you know, I don't know where there's a gun. I try to put my hands up, and all of a sudden, this cop, New York City cop, because he was like 6'4", covered in body armor. He was big enough to be, if he was trying to hide a Volkswagen, he could do it just by standing in front of it. He was big. And he says, nope, he doesn't have a gun. And they left. They just stopped, put their guns in their holsters, and left. I looked up and I noticed he looked like Milt Washington's son. Milt Washington was a friend of mine, photographer who had been the darkroom man for Life magazine. And he looked just like him, so I don't know. Anyway, that's the story. The thing I had shot was a document of 5, 6 poets in the middle of the 9/11 aftermath at CBGB's. And the last poet that I included was one asking for peace. So I got to my apartment, closed the door, and thought about it. Meanwhile, the guys in Queens said, forget it, it's not going to work, we're keeping the thing, the video machine. And Earthbird Presents, my show, which had 97 shows, went into reruns until it closed down in 2018. In prime time, thank you. And then there is God. In God we trust. That is what is said over the judge's desk in housing court. The rump presidency was ready to throw me into the street. The rent I owed was more than was in my debit card. Just out of the hospital, after getting hit with diabetes, they said that I had 800 units of something and I should have been dead. But my vision had been going into bad old TV, so I could see the lines, I digress. Walking from the courthouse, I passed the Bronx Museum, a strange place that had refused to show my work. And when it did, blew it up 15 feet high and gave the credit to Anonymous. Used my famous film, My Country 'Tis of Thee, and got grants for it, then lost the film. As I walked past about living in my car, I asked, no thought, just asked, what was all this about? My religious work, since being blessed with God Go With You, by a cardinal who would become Pope John the 23rd, said the Vatican told the school where I was taking communion class that I had been excommunicated because Pope Pius the Idiot had declared that anyone and their family who fought against Franco was excommunicated. They gave me my first communication, but then made it difficult to continue. In that moment, as I passed the museum with a question mark attached to my thought process, the sky changed. The trees bent toward the opening of the sky where a brightness appeared. That's cool, I thought. Next day, back at court, the world had changed. This is the baptism of the Christ. Isn't that the carpenter's son? No prophet is without honor except in his own house. He is the Lamb of God. God is good. This is my son. Listen to him. Jesus said to Nicodemus, I come to this world, not to condemn it. I am the good shepherd. What is the reign of God? It is like a mustard seed. Full authority has been given to me in heaven and earth. I will make you a fisher of men. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. To whom God has put together, may no man pull asunder. Who welcomes a child, welcomes me. Observe the widow who gives from her wants. Jesus made a whip from cords and drove the money changers out of the temple. Jesus goes to the people and prays and heals. Jesus goes to the mountain to meditate and fight with the devil. As you have sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. He leaves to the stormy sea with his disciples. They fear. He says, quiet, and calms the sea. I am the true vine, and you are the branches. stays in the desert, yet people keep coming to him as he cures a blind man. They tell him a young girl has died. He goes to the mountain, to the house, and says, "Why do you make this noise with your wailing? She is not dead, she is sleeping." He goes to a meeting where he gives orders to the unclean spirits, and they obey him. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Jesus is brought into Jerusalem to people waving palms for his triumph. Jesus is betrayed by Judas and arrested. He is brought before the elders and asked if he is the king of the Jews. He answered, "Yo lo soy." Jesus is tried before Pontius Pilate. Jesus is scourged and crowned with thorns. Jesus is burdened with the cross. The soldiers ask the crowd to help. Pedro denies him. A soldier brings Simon to help carry the cross for Jesus. Jesus meets with the women of Jerusalem. Jesus is crucified. He promises to forgive the two thieves being crucified with him. Jesus asked, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" Jesus is on the cross as his mother and disciples pray for him. Jesus dies on the cross. Jesus is carried to the tomb. The risen Christ is seen in Galilee. The risen Christ presents himself with all the wounds to the doubting Thomas. The Christ breathes on them and they receive the Holy Spirit. Christ unrecognized comes to an outside table where travelers are and asks for some fish and bread.
to reproduce, as in the multitude, there is survival. In the multitude is the new ideas, the new combinations of genetic leaps that brings to humanity the future and the strength to overcome the many beasts that reality produces in a space-time continuum whose limits we have yet to find. It is not a coincidence that once we could see and talk to the four corners of the world, that we became aware of the real estate above our very heads. The imperative to reproduce, or as God said, be fruitful and multiply, would not be limited to the third planet from this sun. This is where we are today, ready to leap out into the new frontier. The world is leaping into the future, not because of nuclear power or psychiatric systems of political domination, but because of the expanding human population. When the New World was discovered, it wasn't bravery that drove the populations of Europe to be the pioneers, but the decision of the governments to rid themselves of the troublesome overpopulation, using visions of greed to move them from their manicured lawns and age-old cemeteries. In each case, the government that sent out its population saw it as a way of extending its borders in the world they had access to. The populations that they sent out were seen as part of the treasure of that country. Their language, common history, skills, loyalty were all an extension of the country that was sending them. This is the value of an expanding population. The value beyond the couple of dollars worth of chemicals that the early scientific planners back in Mexican Revolution called themselves scientificos. That's all these planners, científicos, thought the Mexican Indians were worth, a couple of dollars in chemicals, as they planned their plantations of excess and ego. This attitude was carried into the 20th century by the industrialists, railroad builders, and munitions makers. With the industrialists came the idea that product and money were more important to the government than the people of the country. The fact that they were able to become a focus of power because of capital accumulated by centralized accounting. With this type of power, the so-called, again, a term best described as scientificos, with their idea of a planned utopian economy, began to make inroads into the governing of countries. When Robert S. McNamara brought up the idea of the fourth world, where the industrialized countries would withdraw the benefits of modern society from specific areas of the world, like parts of Africa, Asia, and South America, so those populations would die out and thus leave a reservoir of natural resources for the industrial nations to depend on for later exploitation. He was simply parroting the ideas of the industrial military complex that had been taken over by the longer-range theoretician. They brought other such ideas like strength through peace marches of Munich and the efficient gas ovens of the industrialized genocide. No communication system in the world can hide the ever-burgeoning population of the world as it seeks new spaces to advance into. All it can do is hide the solutions and the positive reality that humanity is starting to manifest. The pressure of bad news brings on frightenness, so that the population will accept their fate as simply as the cattle brought in for the slaughter. Not because there is no room for them in the universe, but because the people who'd become the power in the governing bodies of various countries had no conception of what it meant to rule and be responsible to a population. They had the other solution, the final solution, as they were wont to exclaim as they came out of their shopkeeper dreams, to shower money on the new movers of people's psyches. That made them the actual leaders of the people in the government. Unable to understand the humanistic quality of royal leadership, a logical outgrowth of thinking how the future would treat the offspring of the current kings and such, where the ebb and flow of fortune made leaders always vulnerable to the angry crowd. The so-called longer-range theoreticians sided with the craziest of the ruling families of Europe, mistaking the natural loyalty of the Germanic people toward their authority figures, the result of having severe winters that would keep everybody indoors and, of course, favor a power structure based on a specific type of domineering personalities. For the logical leaders of the 20th century, this century has shown the inability of that group to understand the human condition. Space travel to them was the right of the elite. If you remember your history in the voyages of Columbus, it was the right of the lowest to explore the new frontiers. To those concerned with exploring new frontiers, the logic was inescapable. To the elite that is involved in finding reasons to commit genocide, it is the curse of losing their right to rule. The Holy Roman Catholic Church's stand on abortion showed that the 20 centuries leading the Western world was no accident, and that they were understanding the enormous size of the universe and the illogic of thinking in such limited manners. Unlike the elite that only fought for their own, the Catholic Church is fighting for everybody's population, much to the chagrin of the gender controllers, who have been busy finding ways to blame overpopulation and exercise genocide on a racial basis, expecting the largest empires in the Western world to back them in their attack on the yellow races. Impossible to the elite that thought itself the power of the modern world was the 3,000-year history of resource management that was China's legacy to humanity. They also turned their back to the various harmonizing religions that made life simple and energy efficient. Instead, they demanded that everyone know their increasing acquisition of larger shares of the resources of the world. I'm sure the homegrown elite thought it would go like the West, where genocide of the American Indians resulted in the freeing up of the Western territories for colonization. But that was the result of the population explosion that forced the Indians out of their lands, not the elitist idea that they were acting with God's will. The informal government that based its right to genocide on the genocide basic to the Western expansion into the Pacific lives no longer within the right of the population expansion. The Indians learned that no matter how many whites they killed, there were always more whites that would follow, and so they ran out of space and the West was born. Faced with the same reality as we all are, requires decision based not on ego or greed, but on what is the natural flow of humanity. All people want to survive. All people want an expansive reality. All people compromise all the time to reach new heights of existence. And technology has reached the other planets over 20 years ago. We already have people living off pension plans who did all of their work in the field of space industries. These same people who were so quick to see the need of the people of the world to move freight and themselves to new land are unable to see the need for the expanding population to find new territories in our solar system. Instead, they engage in genocide. Perhaps, as the rest of their social planning indicates, they were only a one-idea people, not the needed world movers and goal makers that society should depend on, no matter what power they seem to manifest. Control that the elite capital accumulators are now under allows them no escape. Genocide is against civic law, moral law, and human sensibility. The masses have continuously ferreted out the elite that tries to wipe them out, and in the process eliminates that part of the genetic pool that thought their jewels, metals, and wealth was the grace that God had given them to act as God over populations that were not into the accumulation of wealth and power. The French Revolution, that has been lately disgraced by American media for its definitive way it dealt with the supposedly controlling elite that had run France to the ground. In one example, one day the king was safe in saying, "L'État c'est moi," the state is me. And the next day, the bloodline of that statement spilled into the sewers of Paris, gurgling into the dead ends that humanity keeps as signposts to the future of the rich and famous play inside the television world, as the welfare roll becomes depleted by a biological component of the final solution, utilized by the informal government that had designated certain members of the United States gene pool as part of the fourth world. Again, what they were selling to the various bureaucrats was that someone had to bring the population of the United States into line with the limits of our small planet. Why did these so-called energy managers ignore the lessons of China? Why didn't they take it for granted that mankind was able to live in close quarters, in style, and in a harmonious manner for thousands of centuries? The reason that they would not think in those manners is because they are not part of the genetic pool that rules humanity. The energy managers are rather part of the genetic pool from the tradespeople whose work defines their lives. They're not developed to think about the flow of history and its responsibility toward humanity. The strength of most of us in the third world is the love of the expansive nature that constant revolutionary process has made in the way the world can work, and the great joy we all feel in conserving our traditions. It is as though the human race sees the need for this diversity of tradition to protect our expansion into the universe. That's right. The inability of the space program to see the acres of New Frontier as a place for expansion can easily be attributed to the society of Nazi rocket engineers that masqueraded as scientists and thus set the goals and understanding of what space exploration was about. For the sake of their war on the United States and the countries they wanted to conquer, there could be no exit from the final solution plan to the population expansion question. The scale that is needed to take the pressure off of the decision makers in the United States so that they can deal with resources intelligently was sidetracked by shifting the space frontier into an elite scientific what can we do in space that we can't do on Earth spiel, rather than dealing with it as new real estate. It was a place for fighting wars and looking at the universe. The rockets they used were economical rather than expansive. Note the difference in the ability to throw large payloads between the United States and the Soviet Union. All the Soviet Union did was attach large rockets together to achieve the large payload. That wasn't high technology. That was the desire of the Soviets to utilize the effort in a larger way. You get to the scale of operation where the population of this world expands in the next decade into the solar system. and onto a better life than is available on Earth. The scale is obvious. The population control people are demanding an Earth population of only 2.5 billion people, so that this fragile biosphere can save itself from the greenhouse effects and save its Brazilian rainforests. We are at, latest figures say 6 billion, and ready to leap into the new real estate that represents not only Mars, the Moon, and the asteroids, but the multiple orbits similar to Earth for large habitoids that are commonly called planetoids or artificial planets, made to allow humanity to expand into our celestial backyard. We don't have to wait until we have faster than light drive to expand into our solar system. The tools and the technology is mature, capable, and easily accessible to all countries, rich and poor. The benefits to the Earth will be enormous, besides relieving the pressure of the population, honorably and without psychosis for future generations. It will solve numerous problems. To what's new in terms of technology. The largest payloads can be achieved now using the superconducting technology to create electromagnetic systems that can throw into outer space all of the constructions needed for a planetoid 250 miles square and its attending 5 by 10 mile cylindrical spaceships capable of housing million people habitats. In the process of building these systems, the grids designed to guide the freight to the proper orbits will be able to supply the world freight with 22,000 mile an hour shipping from the geocentric orbits. Instead of the grid moving, the Earth will revolve past it at a rate of 22,000 miles an hour, and the resulting electromagnetic pipeline will guide freight back and forth as it continues to supply the planetoid and its construction. Power grids on Earth will combine to supply the electricity to these propulsive electromagnetics. Power grids are interesting. It is one of our greatest power system. A electrical grid can be used from entire nations, even continents, and shunted into spaces that can be used to power the electromagnetic realities. Okay. Another problem that will be solved is the food supply of Earth, as the planetoid food supply will be based on soilless farming that will solve the vagaries of drought and natural disasters that have plagued humanity. As the environment will be man-made, humanity's need will make the space ideal for its inhabitants, and since we're talking of the people that were targeted by the informal government, these populations will be paid for the bother that the so-called elite put them through. They will be paid in other ways besides careful, healthy housing and reliable food supplies, as once the planetoid is finished, it will transport 500 million people from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh to Mars, so they can colonize Mars with 500 of the spaceships as pre-planned habitats. With Mars colonized, the planetoid goes on to mine the atmosphere of Jupiter for the various gases that Earth needs to power itself. These are not goals that will be achieved in 100 years or even 50 years. But in 10 years, as all that's necessary to make this happen is a way to throw massive payloads into orbit and be released from the final solution thinkers. This is not a stopgap solution to the population crisis. It is the reason that Earth has been producing its current crops of humans. The human race's most valuable product, to the billionaires or to the poor man looking at his child. It's the same truth to each of them, and that makes it an absolute truth to the human race. There are other places to live beside Earth. The reality of the planetoid thrust into world history is that it solves the most pressing need of humanity. Beyond the need for expansion, the petty differences that are aggravated by inescapable closeness of the neighbors And for this, we only need to look at the insane tensions between Pakistan and India, Thailand, Vietnam, Korea, and Japan, all countries that will benefit from the first planetoid expansion. It is if for a moment you can accept the fact that this large-scale undertaking into space will occur, the seemingly insurmountable differences can easily be seen as enormously petty squabbles that interfere with the necessary large-scale cooperation needed to place a large part of their population into the new frontier. This reality not only promises to alleviate the pressure of the expanding population on the various governments that are finding it incapable of dealing with the mass of dissatisfaction for government that does not provide hope or pride for the historical unity that has kept all these countries viable and healthy for so many thousands of years. Asia has not been allowed to take the next step that their peaceful, long-lived civilizations have already paid for, because they are being forced into a degenerating consumerism that the West has developed to expand the commercialism that has been taken to its limits back in the second 1,000 years of China's history, and finally put into harmonious perspective until the West came with their more efficient killing machines in the 1880s. The constant force of disharmony has stopped the logical use of thousands of years of civilizing influences for the sake of a system that promises to consume the planet so that the people can move from one crowded, bad neighborhood to another crowded, bad neighborhood. The logical use of Western technology is to place at the feet of the most harmonious people on Earth the chance to expand our sphere of influence into the skies and onto the newest chariots we have, the spaceships that have been promised since time immemorial. The effort to find disagreement so they can lessen population disunity and create strong armed states that lower the quality of life for all. And if the elite think that they are above it, remember, you can only trust a bodyguard so far, so the quality of life becomes poorer for the accumulation of power. Hamlet, by Shakespeare, is always a reality as the power flow becomes more stratified by the use of the application of fascist power. And remember, even Rudolf Hess hung himself after finding out that indirect power could give no pleasure or luminosity to his existence. On the other hand, the great leap into space for humanity will make happy heroes of us all. That is the functional reality of planetoid. With the need to manufacture the parts of planetoid, industry expands rather than shrinks. And since an expanding population connected to a new field of mineral wealth brings in additional revenue to the established earth industries, wealth and prosperity is assured, as in the middle half of the 19th century when the United States could swallow any number of European population and produce wealth for everyone. The natural resources that will be made available to the earth would in 10 years be multiplied in unimaginable amount. No, the planetoids and its spaceships won't look like little Star Trek 500 people, antiseptic elite teacups that run from place to place helping other people live. To put a planetoid spaceship into perspective, the size of the cylinders that consist of hull corresponding to the length and breadth of Manhattan Island, and would support 1 million people in outer space with a 5-mile diameter and 10-mile length. On one end, a chemical factory that is a propulsion system, rockets and nozzles and all that. On the other would be what I call a meat farm with terraced mountain 5 miles in diameter for our meat animals, as we are carnivorous unlike the Neanderthals that we wiped out. As the knowledge that there is 50% chance that some of the other inhabitants of the universes are of the murderous variety, it is important for the survival of our race that they understand that we kill too. The sleeping quarters for the 1 million people would be mobile home types, tires and engines and sealed space modules that would be parked on the outside hull of the ship. They would have various, computer systems for power management and large-scale integration, chemical lasering and all this stuff, and would result so that they would all be part of the running of the ships. These space modules would also be launchable with their chemical propulsion systems that they are parked on and interconnected with. Additionally, they carry supplies like biospheres with their own water and growing supplies that make each of those space modules deep space capable. Modules that can land on real estate in space or on Earth and behave as both lifeboats, covered wagons, and as they are armed protectors of the solar system and Earth. The independence of the human race will be served. As you can begin to understand, these technologies are mature, proven, and functional. We're already in the space age, and all the bits and pieces have had their research and development done a decade ago. A third of the population would be in modules, so in case of accident to the spaceship or planetoid, survival of a third would be assured. That is more than you can say for the planet Earth. Lest you think that the population would have nothing to do on the spaceships and the planetoid. Remember that the interior transformation into Earth paradises would be a full-time job, as the interiors of the planetoids would have numerous levels, each 62,000 square miles. Places, areas to landscape, plan, design, care for, and live in. We, the human race, would be the builders. This, of course, is in addition to the mining operations, the moving of population, the freighting and the protecting of our increasing sphere of influence would be sufficient to mark a departure from the 3-day work week that the population-controlled people were planning to institute, as they withdrew the benefits of 20th century living from the populations they were targeting for the public executions associated with discussions of decreasing medical payments. This Earth environment design have been studied and matured in the works of Cousteau with their underwater cities for many decades. The landscaping world is as old as human history. The need to expand is ingrained in our groins. And that is what we really are, a species that moves dynamically through time-space continuum, seeding the empty spaces with life. Mining operations will bring in many of the necessary minerals, and there have been various moons that have been discovered to be ice that will be moved, melted, and distributed to the needs of the humans of Mars, the asteroids, and to the other planetoids that will be built. The expansion of the human population indicates that after colonizing Mars and the asteroids, we will still have enough population to afford 2 or 3 more before we have to stop grazing on the Earth and take our population to better places. If you feel now that our people in this world are our most valuable commodity, congratulations, you have just joined the human race. Planetoid industries are self-supporting as they supply various habitat needs in whatever country they operate, which will be in every country that belongs to the United Nations. The long-term energy agreements for the Jupiter gas deliveries will make the planetoid industry sufficiently financially capable so that the genocidal plans of the informal government will no longer be considered anything more than aberration of the 20th century's more barbaric period.